In the past few years, we've seen an unprecedented number of biological males invade women's competitions. People under names like Leah Thomas, Lena McLaughlin, Valentina Petrillo, Ricky Coley, Cataluna Enriquez, and Brian Newen, amongst countless others, have inserted themselves into women's sporting competitions and their beauty pageants amongst a few other domains. The media, for their part, have went out of their way to celebrate this invasion, just as they celebrated women's invasion of the male space, and they've taken great care to frame it as a watershed moment of barriers being broken. As a direct result of this invasion, an unprecedented number of young women have turned away from supporting the so-called trans community after having spent much of the previous decade regarding them as allies and working alongside the community to help challenge and ultimately dismantle many of the norms, values, traditions, and power structures that have defined Western society for centuries. Many men, including prominent male conservative commentators, have come to the defense of women and have committed themselves to pushing back against the invasion, while men at large have generally adopted a similar stance. The discourse and backlash on this issue has typically centered around the area of women's sports, with the common argument generally being shaped around the notion that biological males have too great of a physical advantage for them to be included in women's divisions. Likewise, the invasion overall has been criticized as putting women at large at a disadvantage while taking opportunities away from them. But this particular argument doesn't quite account for all of the outrage and backlash seen in the past few years. For example, a similar outcry has been made over biological males competing in women's beauty pageants, even despite the fact that biological males have no physical advantage in such a domain. So why is there outrage over it? The answer, of course, is simple enough. We understand on an instinctive level that the male invasion of women's sports competitions and beauty pageants is wrong. Not only is it wrong, but it is genuinely, overtly crazy. We understand on some level, even if we aren't necessarily able to articulate our thoughts on the matter, that not only is this a transgression against women, but it's an attack on women's very identity. It's an attack that asserts that femininity and womanhood are not the exclusive domains of women. It also asserts that these competitions and pageants are not the exclusive domains of women. And all of this is common sense, really. You'll hardly see anyone use this as their primary talking point, but it's the quiet part that everybody's thinking. With that in mind, I recently came across an interesting news story. About a week ago, a female senior high school wrestler in Tucson, Arizona made history as she became the first girl to win the state's top title while competing against boys. Audrey Jimenez of Sunnyside High School won the Division I title, defeating 4 male opponents in the process to help the team win its 7th straight boys team championship. Jimenez, who had previously won 3 consecutive girls championships, filed an appeal with the Arizona Interscholastic Association to wrestle on the boys' side this year, and she was granted approval. Interestingly, the public reaction to her victory has been almost unanimously positive on both sides of the political aisle, at least from what I've seen. The general consensus has been that it's an astonishing achievement and is a testament to the physical fortitude that women are capable of when they apply themselves in such a direction. I was talking to one of my friends about this, and he likened the victory to a man winning a wrestling match against a lion. Now, if you will, hold that thought. We're about to go on a little journey together. When we talk about transgenderism, we tend to have a particular conception in our heads of what transgenderism consists of. We think of men who wear makeup and dresses, for example, or we think of women who cut their hair short and get a double mastectomy. In all of this, we have a tendency to focus primarily on the aesthetics of transgenderism. But what is transgenderism exactly, and where exactly is the threshold between the masculine identity and the feminine identity? Well, that largely depends on who you ask. If you were to ask an LGBTQ activist, for example, they're very likely going to give you a convoluted sermon on how gender exists on a spectrum, and they're going to tell you that there is no definite line between masculinity and femininity. Many academics and scholars of today are sure to give you a similar explanation. If you were to ask me, however, and you always should, I would personally define transgenderism as the act of attempting to emulate or appropriate the behaviors, appearance, and or mannerisms of the opposite gender while basing one's identity around this appropriation. But the main thing I want to point out in this video is that gender-confused men and women tend to approach this quite differently. When biological males appropriate femininity, for example, or when men transition, the first thing we often see them do is externalize this through their physical appearance. They take great pains to make themselves look as feminine as possible, and they begin mimicking female behaviors and mannerisms, albeit often in a clumsy, exaggerated manner devoid of any real gracefulness. They tend to become obsessed with living up to the aesthetics of womanhood to the point where it becomes the only thing they ever think or talk about. In the process, they tend to go so cartoonishly overboard in their appropriation of womanhood that they become a caricature of women. One might ask themselves, why do gender-confused men focus so heavily on aesthetics? And the answer to that is because beauty and image are predominant qualities of womanhood. Men are drawn in by a woman's beauty above all other characteristics. Women themselves are aesthetic creatures, and their personalities are oriented around cultivating their beauty and putting it on display. This is why you see them doing so all day, every day, and it's a primary outlet whereby women express themselves. This is what men see, and when a man attempts to emulate the opposite gender, i.e. women, he largely does so from the standpoint of his own perception of women, and since he sees women as these delicate creatures of immense beauty and hypnotic gracefulness, it's these qualities that he attempts to emulate. On the other hand, women, while being aesthetic creatures, far more so than men are, they're not primarily drawn in by a man's physical appearance. And to be fair, who would? Nor is man himself defined by his aesthetics to the same degree that women are. Rather, man is defined by his will. He's defined by things like his ambition, his strength, and his fortitude. Man is defined by his emotional sturdiness, his resolve, his status, his relative independence, and his authority. It's these qualities that women tend to admire in men, just as men tend to admire physical beauty in women. And it's these qualities that women tend to emulate whenever they go about trying to appropriate masculinity. Much like man's own appropriation of femininity, however, women's appropriation of these masculine qualities tends to be similarly unnatural, strained, and over the top. Over the past decade, we've witnessed this on full display as many young Western women have sought to become the new men in a sense. Many of these women have worked to model themselves after the likeness of men, and what this has ultimately looked like is a generation of women behaving like male chauvinists. We've seen them become loud, arrogant, and outspoken in almost all walks of life. We've seen them embrace exhibitionism and promiscuity on levels never before seen in history. We've seen them not only become almost pathologically ambitious, but we've seen them become obsessed with ambition for the sake of being obsessed with ambition. We've seen them become obsessed with power, power dynamics, and leadership. We've seen them become obsessed with engaging in masculine hobbies and pastimes simply for the sake of subverting feminine norms. We've even seen some women attend so-called assertiveness training classes where they were instructed by other women to talk as deeply and loudly as possible, to aggressively assert themselves whenever dealing with others, to take up as much physical space as possible with their bodies, and even walk with their chest poked out. Many women themselves have become a bumbling embodiment of the negative masculine stereotype that early feminists railed against. Largely as a result of this display of mimicry, combined with the fact that the entire world is going to hell in a handbasket, within the past few years a reactionary movement has cropped up of women returning to traditional femininity, also known as the tradwife movement. But the point I'm trying to make here in all of this is that when women emulate the opposite gender, i.e. men, this doesn't typically manifest in a woman's physical appearance as it does with men. Women first and foremost opt to emulate masculine behaviors and character traits for the reasons that I've mentioned. They try to emulate the most defining characteristics of men, the characteristics that women themselves are drawn to in men, and they emulate these from the standpoint of their own perception of men. Most women stop short of trying to look like men because, for one, they have no real reason to, but secondly, in order to look like men, they would necessarily have to forfeit their feminine beauty and aesthetics, and in doing so, they would forfeit a great degree of their power and influence. Most women actually have a deep-seated fear of losing their feminine beauty. This is why you see them taking such great pains to preserve it. This is also why women in prison fights have the unique tendency to slash each other's faces open with prison shanks. It's the female equivalent to what men do to other men who drop the soap. Many women today spend their lives trying to strike a delicate balance between being externally feminine and internally masculine. But as gender-bending confusion continues to reign supreme in the West, and as masculine women continue to be artificially propped up as the new cultural standard of womanhood, a growing number of women today are increasingly towing the line. Some women are completely transitioning in order to become men. Other women are simply letting their body hair grow, or they're taking up weight training in an effort to acquire a masculine physique, or they're opting to wear masculine clothes or drive masculine vehicles, and other women are externalizing masculinity in various other ways. Funny enough, even though women are less inclined to appropriate masculinity through their physical appearance, some of the very first cases of this appropriation in the Western world came in the form of fashion statements. In the 19th century, there was a dress reform that was underway among women, much of it spearheaded by prominent first-wave feminists. Some of the aims of the reform were logical and reasonable. For example, a practice known as tight lacing was brought under scrutiny, and rightfully so. But the reform itself was largely preoccupied with what early feminists described as women's emancipation from the dictates of fashion. They demanded to be free from the burden of conforming to men's expectations of how women should dress. Several of the key women in this movement made it a point to defy the norms and the dress code of the era by wearing and promoting an article of clothing that would later come to be known as bloomers, a sort of pantaloon for women. Believe it or not, this was a radical statement at the time. It garnered significant attention and backlash from men and women alike, and it would ultimately become a watershed moment for first-wave feminism. During the same era, there were a few notable cases of women who were arrested for wearing pants in public places like courthouses, not bloomers but actual pants, and the most notable of these cases was that of Emma Snodgrass, who was arrested on December 20th, 1852. If you look at the contemporary press reports, there's something very interesting about them. The press were pretty appalled by Miss Snodgrass at the time, and they seem to regard her gesture as an act of public cross-dressing, although not in those exact words. When we look at a case like this today, it seems silly and absurd to us, and we wonder why anyone would ever arrest a woman for wearing pants. But you have to understand, in the 19th century, norms were much different than they are today. The people who were living in the era of Miss Snodgrass regarded her gesture the way we might regard a man who walked into a courthouse wearing a dress today. Around the same time, the first true feminists began to gain momentum, and their arrival marked the beginning of a prolonged period where women at large would begin questioning the traditional role and identity of women, and would begin progressively casting off so-called traditional gender norms, a process that has unfolded more and more over the course of a century and has reached a melting point in our day. After the turn of the 20th century, and coinciding with the unfoldment of the feminist movement, more and more women began to cast aside their traditional identity and likewise began to integrate more and more of the masculine identity into their own personality. This has been such a slow-burning intergenerational process that by the time we reach the 2020s, gender norms have become so non-existent that public female nudity seems normal to most, while grown men can clearly be seen advocating for women to have their chance to lead and rule the world over men. That's how far we've drifted away from normalcy. Needless to say, in our present era, when we look back on reports of women being arrested for wearing pants, we can't help but marvel and wonder what those people were thinking. If the trans community have committed one misstep in their quest to normalize their lifestyle, it's that they've tried to normalize too many things too quickly instead of normalizing them very slowly over the course of a century, as feminists have done. Returning to our female wrestler, when I see this photo and I read this story, I can't help but view it all within the context of everything I've just mentioned, and I can't help but view Miss Jimenez as both a product and a victim of the times that we're living in. I urge you all to look at this story within a broader context, namely the context of the present era. This wasn't just a one-off freak situation, this is part of a much broader trend. This event occurred not only during an era where men are being encouraged to appropriate the role and identity of women, it occurred during an era where women are being encouraged to appropriate the role and identity of men. If I didn't already know from the headline, I would have had a difficult time discerning whether or not Miss Jimenez is a biological female, and I lament that. I lament the fact that so many men in particular are applauding the story and are encouraging her victory, and when I say that, I mean that with no disrespect to Miss Jimenez. I've shared my opinion on this matter online, and I've been met with almost unanimous backlash on both sides of the political aisle. I've had people tell me that I didn't understand sports as a concept. I was told that I didn't understand the honor in her fortitude or respect the work that she's put into her physique, and I was told that I should appreciate the feat of a strong girl overpowering a weak boy in the boys' own wrestling division. Some of you may not realize it, but this is essentially the same thing as saying that a person doesn't understand drag as an art form for not properly appreciating how a burly man can successfully emulate the graceful elegance of femininity. From a gendered standpoint, this is the equivalent flip side to the coin. I feel compelled to point out that so-called trans women have likewise worked very hard on themselves. They've often spent years and tens of thousands of dollars modifying their bodies and shaving down their brow bones, getting electrolysis hair removal and taking hormones and hormone blockers, getting cosmetic surgeries and voice feminization surgeries, taking voice feminization classes and spending years learning how to appropriate and emulate the miraculous graceful femininity that we all know and love. Furthermore, I've heard men say that if Miss Jimenez is capable of performing the task in the male division, then we should be happy to let her compete in the male division. If we feel this way about women competing against men in men's wrestling matches, then why do we look down upon biological males for entering into women's beauty pageants? If these men are able to pass as women, and they're able to beat women at their own game in their own division, shouldn't we let them compete? Whether you want to admit it or not, at the end of the day, it's the same thing. It is one group of people trespassing into the domain of another group of people under the pretext of capability. It's even nuanced in the same way in that men are at a physical disadvantage in women's beauty pageants, just as Miss Jimenez is at a physical disadvantage in the boys' wrestling division. To say that one is valid while the other is invalid is to imply that physical strength is somehow inherently more good or more sacred than beauty. There's really no logical pretext to treat the two cases differently, and for what it's worth, I would personally argue that feminine beauty is equally as mighty as masculine fortitude. You all should know this better than anybody. After all, you have been subverted by it. The problem with drag and the problem with men appropriating the feminine identity, and the reason why we are instinctively opposed to it, is because it is a perversion. We also know instinctively that it violates women and it violates their identity. We know that femininity is the exclusive domain of women. It's like blackface except worse, because not only are these men emulating women, but in most cases they're looking to be regarded as women. Over the past decade, I've seen a growing number of men celebrate women in masculine roles. I've seen them admire and praise women for exhibiting masculine behaviors. I've seen them lust after women who are built like men, claiming to admire the work that they've put into their bodies. I think where men are confused is that they've become convinced that masculinity is not the exclusive domain of men, And I have no doubt that this is largely due to the slow, century-long normalization process that I mentioned earlier. Many of these same men will acknowledge that these activities and behaviors that women are engaging in are masculine, clearly because it's these activities and behaviors that men are currently promoting to other men to help them become more masculine. The problem is that most men today believe that ideally women too should be masculine. Coming on the tail end of this intergenerational process of feminist normalization, we find ourselves in an era where girls are no longer raised to be feminine at all. Most parents today have no idea what that even looks like, and most girls today don't have a single person in their lives, male or female, teaching them how to behave as women. As I've covered in previous videos, many fathers in America today are raising and socializing their daughters as though they were boys. They are engaging girls in almost exclusively masculine activities, while femininity and the healthy cultivation of it falls by the wayside. There are several reasons why men and fathers are doing this, and most of them are innocent enough. Most men today are merely raising their girls in the best way that they know how. They want their daughters to be safe and prosperous, and they don't really know of a better way to encourage that apart from raising and socializing them as though they were boys. To be fair, they've never really been in a situation that called for them to know better. Other fathers out there are trying to fill a void, and many of them don't even know it. Men have a natural desire to raise a son, and this is a male yearning that goes all the way back to ancient times. It's well documented. It's a tradition that's even mentioned extensively in scripture. In the 20th century, feminist theorists wrote about and criticized this proclivity in men. They labeled it as an unhealthy gender norm, and they began working to challenge and ultimately subvert it. By the 21st century, the norm had largely been eradicated, but this yearning in fathers still remained. Many of these men truly wish that they had a son to raise up in their shadow, but this yearning has been strategically diverted. And since they don't have sons, and since they're living in a culture that strongly encourages them to masculinize their daughters, they're raising their daughters up in such a manner to fill the void. 50 years ago, this would have been unthinkable, but thanks to the slow normalization process that I mentioned earlier, this is now the new normal. Other men still, I believe, are driven by their libidos to prop women up in general. All men are compelled and driven by their libidos to some degree or another, and a man's libido is not only active in the pursuit of sex. His libido is a force that inspires him and drives him through life, whether he realizes it or not. In the post-feminist era, man's libido is often demonized, suppressed, and discouraged, and as a result, it is no longer integrated into his overall being in a healthy manner. It is largely confused and diverted in various directions, and men in general no longer know how to recognize when they are being compelled by it. Many of the men who prop women up into men's roles are being compelled by their libidos to do so, even though they may not realize it. Now, don't get me wrong, this doesn't mean that these men necessarily want to sleep with these women. It just means that these men have an underlying force that is compelling them in a certain direction. You might choose to call it libidic passion. You'll notice that most men have zero enthusiasm when it comes to grooming men and propping them up into leadership roles. But when a woman comes along, it suddenly ignites that passion, their eyes get wide, and they pour their heart and souls into propping that woman up. That passion is their libido. I'll leave you all with this. I think it's time for us all to sit down and introspect. I think it's time for us to ponder the short-term and long-term consequences of the direction that we're currently going in. I think it's time for us to start being a little more honest about this entire situation. And I think it's time for us to take measures to return to the identity that God intended for us to have. That's all I got for this one. I'll see you in the next one. God bless you. God keep you. Till next time.